पृथिवी शान्तिरन्तरिक्षगं शान्तिर्द्यौ शान्तिर्दिशः शान्तिरवान्तर दिशा शान्तिरग्निः शान्तिर्वायुः शान्तिरादित्यः शान्तिश्चन्द्रमा शान्तिर्नक्षत्राणि शान्तिरापः शान्तिरोषधयः शान्तिर्वनस्पतयः शान्तिर्गौः शान्तिरजा शान्तिरश्वः शान्तिः पुरुषः शान्तिर्ब्रह्म शान्तिर्ब्राह्मणः शान्तिः शान्तिरेव शान्तिः शान्तिर्मे अस्तु शान्तिः. May there be peace on earth and in the sky. May there be peace in the water and in all directions. May there be peace in the plants, in the trees, and in animals. May there be peace in the hearts of all beings. May there be peace in everyone and in everything. Sarvetra sukhinas santu, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschid dukkha bhag bhavet, sarvastaratu durgani, sarvo bhadrani pashyatu, sarvas sadbuddhimapnotu, sarvas sarvatra nandatu. May all be happy and healthy. May all see what is good, and may no one experience misery. May all overcome their obstacles and acquire good tendencies. May people everywhere find joy and fulfillment. Let us now spend some time touching the center of peace and joy in our hearts. A good way to begin the practice is to withdraw the scattered energies of the mind and bring them to rest on one point. That point can be our own breathing. Let us therefore practice breathing with awareness. As we breathe in, let us visualize that our body and mind are being filled with love, strength, and compassion. And as we breathe out, let us release all the stress, anxiety, and exhaustion in the body and mind. Let us practice this way for a while. Let us now turn our attention to the region of our heart. Although God is present everywhere and in everyone, the divine presence can be felt most clearly in our hearts. We can meditate in any way we have been taught. To remain focused, we can take the help of a short mental prayer or a mantra or a divine name. Let us now spend some time dwelling on the presence of God in our hearts. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om. Good morning. We'll sing Thou My All in All on page 33 of the book. We are very happy this morning to have in our midst Pravrajika Brajaprana. She's a senior nun of the Ramakrishna order. Many of you have had a chance to hear her before. Some of you who are seeing her and hearing her for the first time today. As I said, she is a senior nun from the Vedanta Society of Southern California. We have a convent in Santa Barbara, and she has been there for the last 4 decades. Many of you are familiar with the little book that you have seen in the bookstore and have read, called the Vedanta, A Simple Introduction. She is the author of that book, besides several other books that she has edited and written. Recently, she was on a visit to Brazil, and a Portuguese edition of that book was released. So, a book has been translated into many world languages as well. So, we are very happy that she agreed to come and speak with us this morning on Sister Nivedita. Again, some of you are familiar that Sister Nivedita was an Irish disciple. She's an English disciple, but she's originally from with Irish descent. Her name was Margaret Noble. She was one of the several Western students and devotees of Swami Vivekananda who dedicated their life to the cause of studying and practicing Vedanta. In fact, the word Nivedita in Sanskrit means the dedicated one. So that was the name that Swami Vivekananda had given her when she went and did, and you will get a chance to hear more about her today. So please welcome Pravrajika Brajaprana. Is this okay? Shall I get you on this thing?
Oh, that's good. Good morning. I'm very happy to be back here again. I'm not sure about, I like usually hanging and hiding behind the podium, so this is a little too revealing for me. We'll all get over it together. It's a great pleasure to be here, and it's also a great pleasure to speak on Sister Nivedita, who I've really warmed up to over the years. At first, I had a real problem with her simply because of her kind of Victorian language. There was a lot of forsooths and all this Victorian language, which kind of impeded my appreciation of her. But as the years have gone by, the more I read her, the more I study her, the more profound my genuine reverence for her is. And I'm really happy to be able to share that enthusiasm and genuine reverence with you. So in India, Nivedita is pretty well known, especially in Bengal. In Bengal, there's statues of her, there's a bridge named after her, there's postage stamps of her, and in the West, she's really not very well known at all. And that's a pity, because she was a remarkable woman from whom we could all learn so much. Well, who was she? Swamiji's already told us, stole part of my lecture here. She was an Irish disciple of Swami Vivekananda, a fierce supporter of Irish independence. And she gave her life to India. She gave her life for India and for the uplift of women, and she gave her life to the idea of spreading Vedanta and the message of Vivekananda around the world. She literally gave her life for that work. She single-handedly brought about a resurgence of Indian science and art and appreciation of Indian spirituality and the uplift of women. She single-handedly did this, along with instilling a newfound pride in Indian spirituality and its own history. And her contribution on any number of fronts is simply dumbfounding. That she could have done so much. She single-handedly took India and, like a mama bear, forced it in the direction towards independence and freedom. Her literary output alone is absolutely astonishing. She has 5 volumes in her complete works. She has 2 volumes of letters that are in 9-point print. And to Josephine McLeod, she has 803 letters alone. And it isn't like they're little texts. They're long and newsy and informative and loving. They're absolutely engaging, and a new volume of letters has been found and will be published soon. It's like astonishing how much this woman did. Her letters tell so much about Swami Vivekananda, with whom she was extraordinarily close, so much about Ramakrishna, so much about Holy Mother, about the early years of the Ramakrishna order, so much about the early years of the order and about Indian culture and history and the early movers and shakers with the freedom fighters, the great political figures. I mean, her letters are literal page turners. I really recommend taking a look at them. So what she could do in one short lifetime is absolutely mind-boggling. She was a woman of immense power. She was greatly loved by her guru, Swami Vivekananda, and she was greatly loved by Sri Sarada Devi and the other early members of the Ramakrishna order. And the work that she did kind of leaves us astonished today that any human being could do as much as she did within her very short lifetime. She died at the age of 43. She was an extraordinary woman at a time when it was difficult and really unlikely to be one. It was very hard to be an extraordinary woman during these times. Holy Mother said, was Nivedita an ordinary woman? No, she was a Devi. She was like a goddess. So the more we read about her, the more we read about her, the more we read her works, the more we read what her contemporaries say about her, the more our respect and appreciation for her grows. Truly, the more we get into her, the more kind of mind-boggling it is that this woman could have been there and done so much in one lifetime. She was kind of born to do this kind of work that seems so unbelievable. She gave herself to her work totally, unstintingly, 100% of the time, without reservation, and in doing so, she literally changed the world. One woman's dedication, giving herself so totally changed the world. And that's a wonderful lesson for us all. She was also pretty impossible to be around. You wouldn't want to live with a woman. She was the combination of, like many extraordinary people, two equal and opposing forces. She was tender, she was loving, she was self-effacing, she was giving, and she was obnoxious. She was dominating, she was domineering, she was aggressive, and she was argumentative. And both parts of these personality were intertwined so completely that you couldn't pull them apart, because both parts of her personality were used to do immense good to the world. It's like in the Native American culture where they used every part of the buffalo. It's like you don't waste the teeth, you don't waste the hooves, you don't waste the bones. It's like the Lord took every part of her and wove it together to do immense good to the world. She was charismatic. She knew everybody, and everybody knew her. In England, she was on warm terms with George Bernard Shaw, with Julian Huxley, with Yeats. And when in England, she was close to all the Tagores. She knew all the freedom fighters, including Gandhi, and very close to Aurobindo. She knew the British rulers. She was very close to Lady Minto, the wife of the British Viceroy, and she had personal influence with all those, and she used her influence to get things done, to make things happen. She, Rabindranath Tagore, the great Bengali lyricist and poet who received a Nobel Prize long before Bob Dylan, said, "I have drawn strength from her strength, and I've used my veneration for her as a fuel for propelling me forward." Now, someone like Rabindranath Tagore, that's really quite extraordinary. And he said about her, he said, "Those who knew her saw the extent to which a human being could exemplify truth and consciousness." Now, I have no idea what it means to exemplify consciousness, but I have an idea what it means to have your life exemplify truth. And that's really quite extraordinary. I mean, how many people even want their life to exemplify truth? Sri Ramakrishna said that's the austerity of this age, to be truthful in speech, mind, and very being, and to have someone exemplify that. Oh, that's a wonderful lesson right there. And to be able to, no wonder she was so impossible. She wasn't willing to compromise. She exemplified truth. Tagore said, that's Rabindranath said, Nivedita's was a great life from the example of which other people benefited. In other words, she wasn't getting the benefit of this, except for, in karmic terms. Other people benefited. She decided to submit herself to the high ideal of giving. without any consideration for fear, hesitation, comfort, or zeal. She just gave. She went full throttle and wasn't worried about what this was going to mean to her personally. She just full throttle forward. No thought of self. In 21st century America, we think, man, that's masochistic. You know, we have some medication that will fix that for you, because it's you know, it's not a good balance. But she had that capability, and that Swamiji could see, Swami Vivekananda could see that greatness in her and her ability to suppress her personal needs for a higher ideal. And he was able to use that. And actually Sri Ramakrishna was able to use that to do great good to the world. So 150 years after, we're now celebrating her 150th anniversary. 150 years after her birth, we continue to draw strength from her strength. We continue to draw inspiration from her extraordinary life. And what I find particularly extraordinary is this woman's unbelievable courage. I mean, she didn't ask whether it was okay or whether it was going to be possible. She just jumped in there. And what the other thing I find absolutely inspiring is her refusal to settle. She just wasn't going to settle. She refused to accept what the world said she ought to be content with. It's like, this is your position in life. You just, you know, accept it, do it, just take it in. She wasn't going to stay in England and have a cup of tea and talk about religion and talk about serving humanity. She was going to jump into it. She was going to get her hands dirty. She was going to knock some elbows there. She wasn't going to intellectualize about spirituality or service. She was going to get in there and do it. And she didn't care about the results, what was going to happen to her. And that's another great lesson that we can learn from her. To never compromise our ideals. If we've set a goal for ourselves, better die standing than to give those up and be disappointed in ourselves. She wasn't going to settle. Now, I'll just give some quick biography sketch, but that's not really as important as what we can learn from actually what she's done with her life. So, the reason I just want to talk about it a little bit is that I think Nivedita has great lessons for us all. Not only as people dedicated to Vedanta, not only as people who are dedicated to the Hindu tradition, because it doesn't really matter what religion we belong to, what culture we belong to, what race. I think as simple human beings, we can learn so much from Nivedita and really have, that she really has some life-changing lessons that we can learn from. So she was born in 1867 in Northern Ireland. Her name was Margaret Elizabeth Noble, and she came from 2 generations of Irish Protestant severe ministers, and they were a tough batch. They were sort of unbending in their Christianity. They were, contradictorily enough, they were strong supporters of Irish home rule, and they were very strong patriots, and they loved the British flag, and Margaret took right after them. She was a strong supporter of Irish home rule, and she saluted that Union Jack. She believed that whatever the British did was for everybody's good, including India. So she took that with her. The family was poor, and she was very close to her father, and her father died when she was 10, and it was a huge blow for her. And so after her father's death, she went to a British boarding school, and she fell in love with a Welsh engineer. And even before their engagement could become official, he died very quickly. And so she learned from an early age that life could be very unsettled, very brief, and very difficult to catch. You never knew when it was going to throw you something. So she learned how unstable life could be. She wanted to be a teacher, so she studied how to be a teacher, and from all accounts, she was quite a gifted teacher. So after she'd gone through all these deaths, she really began questioning her own background. She began questioning the Orthodox Christianity she'd been brought up with, and she began studying Buddhism. She became an ardent feminist, and she became very politically involved with Irish freedom, and all these tenets she sort of kept towards the end of her life. She was fiery in the support of Irish independence while also being very supportive of the British. So while she was living in London in 1895, she went to one of these parlor talks and Swami Vivekananda was speaking. And she wasn't particularly impressed. She said later that he spoke above her level, but she also said she felt like he wasn't saying anything new. And both were true. He was speaking above her level at the time, and he wasn't saying anything new. But what he said was sort of like water against granite, and she wasn't letting go of the ideas either. They began kind of working at her. And so the next week she came back to listen to him again. And then what he said really got her, because what he said was that it wasn't about belief, it was about experience. It wasn't about what you state as what you believe, but what you know and have as your very own. That got her. That made a huge impression on her. She didn't know at the time that he had already made this huge impression at the Parliament of Religion. She didn't know that he was being adulated in India and people were falling all over themselves to do some kind of service, nor would she have cared. But what made a difference was then he said it has to be your own personal experience. So he left. He went to Europe. But when he came back to England in the spring, she was ready for him. And she attended every class, she attended every lecture, and she asked him questions. Everything, she kind of chewed on it and gnawed on it until she could make it her own. And that's another lesson that we can learn from Nivedita, because she asked questions, but they were really good questions and they were important questions. Sometimes her questioning is nothing more than like intellectual gas. It's like intellectual burping. Undigested stuff. We just make sounds. She really knew the questions to ask, and she wrote him a letter where she asked him like the best question ever, and it was like, "What is your ideal?" I mean, what a great question to ask somebody. What is your ideal? It's like, who even thinks of asking someone? But it was a wonderful question. And he wrote her an extraordinary letter in response. He said, "My ideal can be put into a few words, and that is to preach unto mankind their divinity and to make it manifest in every movement of life." He said, "One idea I see as clear as daylight is that misery is caused by spiritual ignorance and nothing else. Who will give the world light?" He asks her this. Who will give the world light? The world is in need of those whose life is one burning love. Selfless. That love, he writes to her, that love will make every word you tell like a thunderbolt. What an extraordinary letter. And he said to her in this letter, he said, "You have within you the making of a world mover." He could see that in her already. And he said, "Let us call until the sleeping gods awake, till the God within answers the call." He wanted her to go to India to work for the uplift of women. He wanted her to work for the education of women because he knew that India didn't have a chance of moving forward until the women were educated. Only then could India move forward. So he writes her this. Who will answer the call? So she was, sign me up. Sign me up. And that is another great lesson, that when we hear the call of truth, and we know that call is directed to us, we go, sign me up. We don't dilly-dally, we don't shilly-shally, we don't idle our time away, we don't idle our life away. When we hear the call of truth, and we know it's directed to us, we say, sign me up. We don't wait. She just answered the call. She didn't hesitate for 1 second because she knew it was the call of truth and she knew it was directed to her. So he warns her. He says, okay, this is going to be tough. But one thing that Nivedita had, and this is another great lesson, she had immense shraddha, which is weakly translated as faith, but it's way more than that. She had immense faith that she could do the work that she was meant to do, that she could do it. She had immense faith in herself. She had immense faith in Swami Vivekananda. She knew that whatever he gave her to do, she would be able to do. She knew, she had the kind of shraddha that Yama saw in Nachiketa. And that's why Swamiji had such faith in her, that she would be able to, because she didn't question it for a second. She just said, sign me up. She knew she could do it. So she had this power of shraddha, and this is a wonderful lesson for us, to have that kind of faith, that when we get a call, that we respond, but also we have that kind of faith in ourselves that allows us to respond to the call and allows us to live the life that we're supposed to be living, to go for it. And she was able to respond and say yes to a work that 99.9999% of the world said would be impossible. You can't do it. Not only Indian, you can't do it as a British or as a white woman. No one can do this work. But she knew that Swamiji gave her, and she took the work up with pride and with gusto. I'm on it. I'm going to do it. And he warned her. He said, this is going to be harder than you can possibly imagine. The very people you go to serve are going to hate you for the color of your skin. As soon as you walk out the door, they're going to be putting Ganges water in, if they ever allow you in the door at all. You were going to be humiliated. But as Holy Mother said, she was humiliated, but at every door she left smiling, because she knew she was doing the Lord's work. She knew, and Swamiji gave her the work because he knew she was doing Sri Ramakrishna's work for the uplift of women and for the spreading of Vedanta around the world. Nothing deterred her. He warned her again that the sacrifices would be endless, and she was completely undeterred because she knew it was work that she was born to do. So by 1898, she had arrived in India, and Swamiji gave her her first vows of what they call brahmacharya, and he gave her the name Nivedita, which means dedicated, and never was a truer name given. It was interesting because she gets there and she's like, give me the work. I'm here to do your work. Yes. And he was in no hurry to do so. Instead, he kind of made her cool her heels. And instead of sending her out to work, he would go over every day and he would just talk to her very informally. He would talk to her about Indian values, Indian mores, Indian culture, Indian history, Indian civilization. He would go on for hours and hours, for days, sometimes just by herself, sometimes with other Western women, Mrs. Oli Bull, Sarah Bull, and with Josephine McLeod. But it was like he was pouring, she had to be like a sponge and take in all of India like that. She had to absorb it like a sponge. Because otherwise, unless she really understood India, she could no way serve India. Because otherwise she would have gone over with her ideas of British superiority, and she would have thought that she was going to help them in the way that she thought that they ought to be helped, because this is what they needed. In order for her, she had to become Indian on an almost cellular level. She had to become so identified with the culture, with the mythology, with the ideals, the Indian ideals of life, that she couldn't even think British anymore. She couldn't even think Irish anymore. She had to, because only through love and understanding can you ever serve. How can you serve someone if you don't understand them? How can you serve unless you love? She had to be at that basic and instinctive a level that she really knew how to serve. That's what he demanded of her, and that's what she was willing to do. She was willing to pull back her skin in order to be able to serve. What an dedicated doesn't even begin to cover it. That's real giving. So he warned her, and the reason he said is, if any of us Westerners, this sounds familiar, he said, Western people do have the peculiarity of trying to force upon others what seems good to them. Sound familiar? Native Americans, let's make them Christian, let's take away their language, let's go to Vietnam and help them get away from communism. It's like, it's a disease. He said, as such, I'm afraid you'll try to force upon others whatever turn your mind will take. Dangerous and to be able to do so, because when you teach, it's, especially from a British Indian point of view, it's not a level playing field. The playing field has to be level. And it always has to be through love. That's the only way it's going to work. Vivekananda, Swamiji, invested a huge amount of time and effort and love into training Nivedita, and you just got to wonder why. I mean, he had so much other things to deal with, and he was tough on her with good reason, because she was bullheaded, she was proud, she was arrogant, and she was argumentative, and she was resistant to being taught. Anything that the British did, she was convinced was for the world's good. He had to absolutely break her down for her to be able to understand anything. And at one point, the scolding got so severe that Josephine McLeod came over and tried to intervene. She went over to Swamiji. It was like, can you please cut this out? And he said, do not spoil her. He said, I have devoted more time to her than to anyone else. Now, when you think about who else he was training at the time, all his great Indian disciples who did so much work throughout the world, so much. His own brother disciples, his own work, starting the Ramakrishna mission, he says he devoted more time to her than anyone else. I mean, that's really quite extraordinary. Why? Because he knew that Nivedita was doing Sri Ramakrishna's work, the work to uplift the women, the work to spread Vedanta throughout the world. It was an extraordinary work that he entrusted her to do. That's why he did it. So when her training is finally over, she goes to this tiny little place in Bog Bazaar, the Indian quarter of Calcutta, where the British rarely are going to dirty their feet. And she's living in conditions that are not only fairly difficult they're not only impossible for Indians, I mean for the English, for Indians they're tough. I mean, there's no escape for the unbelievably terrible Indian summer. There's no escape for out there. And during the rainy season, she had to go up with an umbrella to go to the second floor. It was dirty. It was tough. It was a really difficult time. But for her, it was heaven, because she was living as an Indian among the Indians. And it was a very difficult life. And what made it even worse was that she tried to start this little school, and no one wanted to send their children there. Nobody wanted to have anything to do with her, because she was a Westerner. She was an outsider. They weren't about to send their girls there. She was everywhere she would go. She was humiliated. So Holy Mother said, look at Nivedita, a Western girl who came to our country and worked happily, forbearing insults and harassment and enduring so much discomfort. And she talks about her, as soon as she walks out, everyone's throwing Ganges water to because her very presence is considered defiling. But she said she left every place with a smiling face. Now, Nivedita was not the type of person to feel miserable and put on a smiling face. If she was unhappy, she let the world know. She was genuinely happy because she was doing Vivekananda's work. She was doing the work that she felt privileged to do, doing this difficult work. Finally, a few people started sending their kids. She begged, literally on bended knee, she was begging them to send their little girls to the school. Finally, a few started coming, and the work very gradually started happening. She started working harder and harder in her own little place, more little kids coming. When plague broke out in Calcutta, the Ramakrishna mission started work immediately, and she was in the thick of it. She started going over and nursing plague patients, and Swamiji scolded her. He said, look, I can't lose one person over one person. He said, you have to do a much bigger work. What is the source of the plague? So she went out there herself and cleaned the streets with her own hands. The Indians were leaving in droves. She was there cleaning up the streets with her own hands. That got the respect of the people, because they felt embarrassed that a British Irish woman would come over and clean their streets with her own hands. Then they started getting it. She's in for the long haul. She's not trying to dominate over us. She's in it for the long haul. She's one of us. So that brought more people, and her work started growing, and she started working harder and harder and doing more and more things. And you can see why she's called Nivedita, because this one-pointed dedication of hers literally changed the world. And that's another lesson that we learned from her. That her 100% giving of herself to her work literally literally change the world, sort of metaphorically move the world on its axis. And the point is, we can too. If we give ourselves to whatever our role in life is, we can really change our own life and change the world too. None of us are going to be the type of world mover that Nivedita was, nor should we be. But, we're all like Rama's squirrel. We all have our little roles to play in this world, and whatever our role is, to be that dedicated to it, to give ourselves that thoroughly, and invest ourselves and commit ourselves that much, if we do it with that much sincerity and dedication, we can make our life a blessing not only to ourselves, but to the world, no matter how big or small our role in the world is. To have that sort of 100% dedication. And that's a huge lesson for us all. We all have our gifts to give to the world, whatever it may be. But to give it with that kind of 100% dedication, throwing ourselves into it, that's a lesson. She was a powerful speaker. And she became, in a very short time, a spokeswoman for the Hindu spiritual tradition. And she, in one sense, she was a powerful speaker because she had learned to speak not to the ear outside, but to the mind inside. What do I mean by that? She said when she was in England, she always assumed that the mind was sort of secondary to the body. That she couldn't imagine a mind without a body because our experience is that we think because we've got a mind. We've got a body, and therefore I've got a mind that works. And she naturally thought, well, when the body goes, the mind's going to go too. But she said, under the training of Vivekananda, she realized that in India, the pivot in India is the mind, not the body. That we are a spirit. We're a spirit that has a body, not a body that has a spirit. So when she started speaking, she learned to address the mind within the inside and communicate to others mind to mind, not from mouth to ear. And she said because of that, her mind had become not only very powerful, but very subtle. And she was able to be an extraordinarily powerful speaker because she kind of avoided the middleman. She went right from mind to mind. She was able to, for example, like her guru, she was a very devout follower and devotee of Kali. She was an ardent lover of Ma Kali. And so she gave a talk on Kali at Albert Hall in Calcutta, which created a huge sensation. For those who were practicing Hindus, it was kind of a revivification of their own faith. It was like a reinvigoration, a sort of an affirmation of, yes, this is true, what we're doing is right. And the British were like, it shocked the pants off the British that this Irish-British educationalist comes over and she's talking about the glories of Kali. And for the educated Hindus, it was a nightmare because they were telling the British, oh, no, it is only the masses that believe such thing. Educated Hindus wouldn't believe of worshiping Kali. We had known nothing about that. And there she was, this educated British Irish educationalist who's proclaiming the glories of Kali in India. It was unthinkable. But you see, because and we have to see at this point how far she's come. She's the daughter and granddaughter of Irish Protestant ministers, and for many people, being in the 21st century, to be a follower of a black goddess seems pretty outrageous. Imagine in 1890. Imagine for a British woman to go to a subjugated country and say, their goddess is the one that's speaking, is the truth. This is the way to go. You can imagine that was like for her family, for her friends. You can imagine what that was like. But for Nivedita, Kali was the paradox of ultimates. She was a loving goddess, and she was also the impersonal reality of the universe as we experience it. Right? Because she says the most remarkable thing. She said to her huge Calcutta audience, no betrayal of truth is so terrible as that of choosing what is beautiful and easy and soft to be worshipped and believed. let us face also just as willingly the terrible, the ugly, and the hard. Anyone here not dealt with terrible, ugly, or hard? If you have, raise your hands, because I would love to meet you. Tell me what it's like. Right? Because this is our experience of the universe. We have to deal with the terrible, the ugly, and the hard. A lot of times at the time we're least expected to be able to deal with it, right? How can we talk about God as loving Father when we know that bad things happen to good people? Is God ineffectual or just doesn't care? I mean, either way, it's a lose-lose, right? What is that? Because our experience of the world is that the universe comes in pairs of opposites. For every birth, we know there's a death. For every success, there will be a failure. For every joy, there will be a sorrow. We know that. For every bit of praise we get, we know that the blame's right around the corner. Just wait. Get ready for it. Get your knees off. We know that's how the universe works. So get ready. And that's another lesson we learned from Nivedita. Jai Kali. Jai Kali. Let's worship the universe as we experience it. Let's try not to hide that side of the world from us and say it isn't real or isn't part of the divine plan. It is. It all comes together in the divine play of Mother Kali. And she understood that in a very visceral sort of way. And this is another thing we have to thank Nivedita for. Because she has some conversations with Swami Vivekananda about Kali that are absolutely unbelievable, and the only place we find them are in her letters. So she records in her letters to Josephine MacLeod. She said, Swamiji told her how I used to hate Kali and all her ways. That was my 6 years fight with Sri Ramakrishna, because I would not accept Kali. So Nivedita asked him, she said, but now you have accepted her specially, have you not, Swami? Because Swami himself, Swami Vivekananda, became an ardent devotee of Kali after fighting her, for 6 years. And Swamiji answers, I had to accept her. Ramakrishna Paramahamsa dedicated me to her. And I believe that she guides me in every little thing I do and does just what she likes with me. From Swamiji. Yet I fought so long. I loved the man, Sri Ramakrishna. And that held me. I thought him the purest man I'd ever seen. And I knew that he loved me in ways that my own father and mother had not the power to do. Wonderful, isn't it? Nivedita asked him whether it was Ramakrishna's greatness that made the love hold him. And he said, his greatness hadn't dawned on me then. I thought he was a brain-sick baby, always seeing visions. I hated it. And then I had to accept Kali too, he tells her. And she says, it's like, won't you tell me what made you do that, Swami? And he says, no, that will die with me. I had great misfortunes at the time my father died and so on, and she saw the opportunity to make a slave of me. Those were her very words, to make a slave of me. And Sri Ramakrishna made me over to her. Wow. Nowhere else do we get this kind of glimpse behind the veil. Nowhere else. That he was that close to Nivedita to tell her something that spiritually intimate is amazing. Nowhere else do we find this. We have to thank her for this glimpse. So when Swamiji died in 1902, she was, along with everybody else, just drowned in a sea of grief. And now her life starts taking another direction because she keeps hold with her deep spiritual roots, but now she becomes much more politically involved. She was very close stays very close to the Ramakrishna order. She stays very close to Sri Sarda Devi, sees her pretty much every day. And she's very close to the disciples, but she becomes very politically activated. And because of that, she has to publicly announce that she's no longer associated with the Ramakrishna mission, because otherwise they would have thrown the monks in jail. The British would have taken that opportunity to take our monks and to put them into prison. So she has to dissociate publicly, even though they were very close to her. And in fact, the monks accompanied her wherever, especially Swami Tyagananda was like her protector and took care of her wherever she went. She also, not only Indian politics, she became deeply involved in the resurgence of Indian art and Indian culture. It was like, get away from these Western models. You have your own culture. This is our own culture. This is our own history. We need these to be our models, not trying to mimic some European things. We don't have an understanding of it. This is our culture. These are our ideals. And she contributed enormously to the flowering of Indian literature and art in ways that are still being felt today. Her little house in Baghbazar became filled with artists, with freedom fighters, with revolutionaries, with the bomb throwers. These are people, her little house was just breaking out with people, and she got very little rest, very little sleep. And that woman never stopped working. When Aurobindo left, she started editing his newspaper. She did everything in so many directions. By 1911, she was weak and she was increasingly ill. She worked herself to death. The people were starving, and she was always giving her own food to everybody else because the people were starving around her. So her dear friends, Jagadish Chandra Bose and his wife, she was, by the way, among all of the other things, she was deeply involved in the resurgence of Indian science. Single-handedly brought this force to bring forth India's own scientists. And Jagadish Chandra Bose, she did 5 books for him. And he was knighted because of all of her efforts, Sir Jagadish. So she was very close to him and his wife, and they thought she needed a change of air because she was so weak and so ill. So they took her up to Darjeeling, and there she contracted blood dysentery, and it was universally fatal. She knew she was dying, and they knew she was dying, and she was completely at peace. She was absolutely at peace about it. Nivedita was a real ideal karma yogi. And I think this is another great last lesson for us. At the end of her life, everything that she worked for, she thought was gone. The only work that Swamiji had entrusted to her, and her alone, was the education of Indian women. And because perhaps her little place in Baghbazar was so overwhelmed with everything, there were the freedom fighters were there, the revolutionaries were there, the artists were there, the politicians were there, the scientists were there. All the children being educated were there, that the 2 people who were helping her there, who were actually running the school, which was Sister Christine and Sister Sudhira, they left. They said, I cannot do this anymore. They started teaching in a Brahma Samaj school. So she was left alone. And she had to close the school. The one thing that Swamiji entrusted to her. She begged Sudhira to come back, and Sudhira said, no way. Can't live like that. Apart from that, she was very domineering, and who can live with that day in and day out? All the people that she was particularly close to had died. Swamiji died in 1902. Her close friend Sarah Bull had died. Swami Sarupananda had died, and finally Swami Sadananda had died. And all the revolutionaries, the freedom fighters, the revolutionaries, every single one that she was close to were either dead, imprisoned, or exiled. It looked like the freedom movement was at a dead standstill. It would be 36 years before India achieved independence. It looked like everything that she invested, everything in her life, was just ashes, gone. And she was at complete peace about it. No regrets, no thinking of, oh God, if only. She was in deep peace, which shows how powerful her inner life was. She had extraordinary public life, a powerful outer life, that any of us, if we did a tenth of it, we'd be dead. But even more powerful than her external life was her internal life. the meditation that she got from Swamiji, the mantra, that kept her strength. That kept her going. So that at the end, she was able to take a view of a real karma yogi and look at it and go, I did the work. It's the Lord. For better or for worse, that's what it is. She was able to completely let it go without worry or regret. That it's quite extraordinary that anyone could do that. Just before she died, which she was happily kind of sinking into, she said, I'm thinking more and more, she wrote this just before she died, I'm thinking more and more that death means a withdrawal into meditation, the sinking of a stone into the well of its own being. I wonder if it would be possible to resolve one whole life into love and blessing, so that in eternity at least one would be delivered from thought of self. You know, this woman who was so domineering and arrogant and abrasive just wants every thought of self erased from her. And she said to know oneself only as a presence of peace and a benediction for the whole world. Wow. At the end of one's life to be able to write that? How extraordinary. When she died, Holy Mother wept. She said, all creatures weep for such a great soul. Now, part of being an ideal karma yogi, a real ideal karma yogi, is the ability to take the long view, which she was able to do. And she wrote incredibly prophetically to Josephine MacLeod. You see, when we who have understood Swamiji and remember him are dead, there will come a long period of obscurity and silence for the work that he did. It will seem to have been forgotten until suddenly, in 150 or 200 years, it will found to have transformed the West. Now, for those of us born and brought up here, we can only say how true that is. This is not the same world, intellectual world, that we were born into. This is a very different intellectual space. So for those born and raised here, we can only say, oh my God, how prophetic, how amazing that she could see that from 150 years. And we can only be grateful to her for what she's done for us all and what we continue to learn from her. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Nivedita's life, as we just heard, has been such an inspiring life. For those of us in Boston, there's the close association of Nivedita with the city. Some of you may not be aware that she spent a lot of time on Brattle Street in Cambridge. There was the residence of Mrs. Oli Bull, who was also a student of Swami Vivekananda, so fellow student of Nivedita. So she came when Mrs. Oli Bull in 1910, I believe, when she was very sick, and Nivedita came to serve her. She stayed for a long time in Brattle Street, and including at the Longfellow Park, you know the residence of poet Longfellow, and she was a friend with Longfellow's daughter. And so after Mrs. Oli Bull passed away, she stayed several weeks in that Longfellow's home as well. So there is that association of hers with the city. Also, MFA, the Museum of Fine Arts, among the first two earliest curators there, one was Okakura, a Japanese gentleman. When he visited India, and as sister said, Nivedita was so interested in the Indian cultural traditions and so on. So when Okakura, great art researcher, he visited India, it was Nivedita who took him around and showed him Ajanta, Ellora, many of these Hindu and Buddhist sites, made him familiarize with the things. And then she co-wrote a book with Ananda Kumaraswamy, a Sri Lankan scholar, who was also a curator at MFA. So I don't know for sure, but one of the reasons that the Indian section at MFA is so well developed, among the really good collections in the country, that whenever you visit MFA and you see the Indian section there, somehow the spirit of Nivedita is present even there through the great influence she had in one of the two curators who were responsible for developing that section at MFA. So, and then those of you who would like to know more about her, among the books that I can recommend, Sister already mentioned about her enormous, a deep mystical connection with Kali. So she had got this tiny little book called Kali the Mother. It's an amazing, insightful study of what Kali means, not just the external description, but what does the divine represented in the form of Kali mean. So that's one book I would recommend. Also, her reminiscences of Vivekananda, called the Master as I Saw Him. When I was studying in college, that was one of my favorite books. I probably read it 3 or 4 times even before I joined the order. Very inspiring. And there's another one called the Cradle Tales of Hinduism, like a retelling of the stories from Indian history and mythology for the younger generation. Her language might seem a little bit dated today because it's still a little old style, but nevertheless it has retained the power and the beauty. So those are some of the books I would encourage you to take a look at. So Sister, thank you once again, and then please do visit us again. Next week we will have one more guest speaker, Professor Francis X. Clooney of the Center for the Study of World Religions at the Divinity School at Harvard. He has spoken here before, and he will speak with us next week, and his subject will be how Mary matters to Christians at Christmas. I would encourage all of you to come because it's a very topical subject, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of great insights to learn on this important theme. On Wednesday, we will continue with our study of the Gita as we do. And on Tuesday and Saturday, our Arati and meditation will also continue as usual. Let's conclude with a prayer now on page 3. May the Divine Being, who is the Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May we be granted strength, freedom, and clear understanding. May we learn to see God in our own hearts and in everyone around us. May God bless us all and fill our hearts with gratitude, grace, and love. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.